Traveling through a trail for 2 hours, the police reached the location. Arcadio Alvarez was found in a sugarcane field. It was at that moment that they apprehended the suspect, who was accused of committing incest for about 30 years against his eldest daughter, Alba Nidia, with whom he had at least 14 children, of which 8 survived. Very little is known about the childhood and youth of Arcadio Alvarez. We know that at some point during his youth, he formed a relationship with a woman whose identity has not been disclosed, and with whom he had a daughter. It appears that his partner died in 1979, and he was left to care for the little girl, who was then 5 years old. The girl's name was Alba Nidia Alvarez, who later became known as Nidia. After the death of his life partner, Arcadio moved into the home of a relative, an aunt of Nidia's, though it was unclear whether she was his sister or the sister of his deceased wife. However, a few years later, Arcadio began to encounter problems in that house, which is unsurprising, as the man started to abuse his daughter. This inappropriate behavior began when she was 5 years old. When she was around 13 years old, Nidia gave birth to her first baby, a boy who was also her brother. For her, this situation was always a tragedy, but her father was indifferent to it. They eventually settled with his family in a small village very far from everything in the south of Colombia, where only the most basic services were available. There were barely 200 families living in the area. Arcadio was a farmer with very few resources. As a result of his precarious economic situation, upon arriving at the place, he settled his family in a fragile and unstable wooden house with a zinc roof and dirt floors. It is noteworthy that by the time Arcadio arrived in that area, the family had 4 children. For the people of the region, initially, nothing seemed too strange. They simply saw the newcomers as good people, even though they were not very sociable or communicative. Nidia was a very reserved young lady and did not socialize with the local residents. In fact, she never left the house unless she was with her father, and she was essentially only seen when going out to buy supplies for the family alongside Arcadio. Some were concerned that she was school-age but did not attend the public school in the town. However, they never inquired about the reasons why the father did not send her to school. One day, reality struck everyone when it became evident that Nidia was pregnant. If she didn't leave the house, didn't have a boyfriend, and her father exercised complete control over her eldest daughter, the only possible conclusion was that the young girl, while a minor, was being abused by her father. But even though the abuse situation was clear to everyone, no one spoke. By the time Nidia was over 20 years old, she had had 11 pregnancies, not all of which came to term, and not all of the babies born survived. Nidia never gave birth in a hospital. It was often up to someone else to help her bring into the world the children fathered by Arcadio. In the small town, everyone gossiped about this. Initially, they were horrified, but nobody said anything. Of the 14 children Arcadio and his daughter Nidia had, in the end, only 8 survived, 3 girls and 5 boys. Only Nidia learned to read and write because her father taught her. The rest had all their rights violated, starting with the right to an identity, since they were never legally registered. It was as if they did not exist. Without an essential document like the birth certificate, they could never enroll in the small local school that around 80 children attended, nor were they vaccinated or treated at the local clinic. Local inhabitants later reported that they saw the irregular couple when they went out shopping and never noticed any affectionate relationship between them. Some neighbors claimed they had the chance to talk with Nydia, but instead of offering help or some kind of support to get out of the situation in which she was the victim, they blamed her. They told her that having intimacy and children with her father was not right. Her response was always to remain silent. No one ever dared to confront Arsadio or reproach his misconduct. Later, some neighbors claimed that while he seemed like a decent man, he was extremely serious, and the people feared he might do something to them. Over time, the forbidden carnal relationship between relatives became something everyone started to accept as normal in the locality. Apparently, on a few occasions, the Alvarez's home was visited by personnel from the local Secretary of Education and the Colombian Institute of Family Welfare, as well as representatives of the Catholic and evangelical churches. The goal of all was to motivate the parents to send the kids to school, but this never had any effect. To make matters worse, these organizations also failed to pay attention to the fact that the children were not legally registered. It seemed that at that moment, the wind was blowing in Arsadio's favor. However, Arsadio pushed the limits too far, and that was the beginning of the end of his sinister plan of subjugation and abuse to the detriment of his entire family. As Nydia later recounted, her father began to show interest in perpetuating his deviant behavior with at least one of his granddaughters, who was around 11 years old. And as if his immoral behavior wasn't enough, he began to insinuate to his older male children that they could do the same. This undoubtedly set off alarms for Nydia, and it could be said that a divine intervention paved the way to the end. Around that time, Orlando, a pastor from the Pentecostal church, spoke to those present at one of his sermons, including Arsadio, who wanted to appear as a correct and faithful man, about the topic of incest and what it meant, labeling it as a terrible sin. This was a turning point in Nydia's life, who, at the end of the meeting, approached the pastor to ask him to pray for her. But the stars were aligning, as around that time, the world learned about the terrible case of Elisabeth Fritzl in Austria, whose father, Joseph Fritzl, kept her captive in the basement of his own house for 24 years, fathering 7 children with her. The case of Elisabeth was so shocking that it seemed people around the world were willing to prevent such situations from being repeated. It was this story that propelled Nydia to make a definitive decision. Also, religious conviction that her father was forcing her to commit a sin, and the fear that one of her daughters could become a victim of the same man added to the need to protect her descendants from the father's brutal assaults. The man, who always had a hellish temperament, beat one of his 6-year-old sons for waking him from his nap by fighting with one of his sisters. That, apparently, was the last straw. At that moment, Nydia confronted her father who, as he always had, reacted by hitting her. This was the strategy the man had used for years to ensure obedience through fear. But this time was different. Fueled by rage and courage, Nydia fought back, something that surprised Arsadio. Nydia knew she had no other option but to leave that house. For that, she not only gathered courage but also had the full support of her older daughters. Trusting in God's will and with the strength gained from her conversations with the pastor at the first opportunity, Nydia took her 6 youngest children and fled the humble house that had been her prison. The 2 oldest male children, 18 and 16 years old at that time, chose to stay with their father. The group left and headed to a nearby town, where Nydia took some time to settle her family before formally filing a complaint against her father with the authorities. Initially, she only dared to accuse him of having beaten her young son, but later she expanded the complaint to detail the years of abuse she herself had been a victim of. Clearly, before taking any action, the authorities had to conduct an investigation to corroborate the serious accusations Nydia had made. Meanwhile, Her 6 children depended solely on her, and they were in a different town where rent had to be paid. But if there was something Nydia was an expert at, it was working hard, so it didn't take too long before she found a job at a local restaurant. She worked exhausting shifts, starting at 5 in the morning and finishing at 8 at night. She devoted 15 hours of her life daily, from Sunday to Sunday, to the demanding job that barely earned her 7,000 pesos, less than $4 at that time. In the meantime, her eldest daughter, 16 years old, took care of her siblings and became the most important support for the suffering mother. However, the authorities who heard Nydia did not make much effort to investigate what happened, and valuable time was lost for the woman and her children in terms of receiving the support they were justly entitled to from the Colombian state. The first to take real action on the complaint was a family commissioner who, seeing that the case was not being properly addressed, decided to send the information to Hugo Parra, a close collaborator of a counselor. Months had passed after the first complaint was made when Hugo, representing the counselor, arrived at the house occupied by Nydia and her children to learn firsthand what had happened. The man was completely shocked. As Hugo later told the media that covered the story, Nydia and her children were living in extreme poverty. The house they inhabited was in terrible condition, lacking clean water. The smell was almost unbearable. And of Nydia, only her shadow remained, as the 35-year-old woman looked almost 70. At that moment, it was decided to make the case public knowledge and to start a strict follow-up of the progress of the complaint. The following months were dedicated to gathering testimonies that would attest to the truthfulness of Nydia's accusations. Finally, in January 2009, it was considered that there were sufficient elements to present the case to the General Attorney of the nation. Immediately, the highest authority of the public ministry ordered a group of detectives to start investigating the facts officially and in depth. The impunity that Arcadio had enjoyed came to an end on March 27, 2009. That day, agents of the investigation team, known by its initials as CTI, initiated an operation to capture the alleged perpetrator. They had to travel 2 hours through intricate paths to reach the sugarcane plantation where Arcadio was known to be. Finally, the 58-year-old man was detained. In his initial statement to the authorities after being arrested, Arcadio maintained that he had never forced Nydia to engage in inappropriate sexual relations and also asserted that she was not his biological daughter but had been adopted. Needless to say, he also denied having intentions of abusing his daughters, much less having instigated his older sons to do so. Upon hearing her father's statements, Nydia affirmed that he used the same argument of her supposed adoption to abuse her. She added that her father subjected her to the most terrible treatments, besides having her practically imprisoned since she lived locked up and could not go anywhere unless it was with him. Among everything, perhaps the most surprising was when she claimed that he would always be her father and as such, she had to respect him. She then detailed that she always maintained in her conversations with Arcadio, when trying to reason with him, that she loved him as a father and never saw him as a man. On March 28, 2009, the trial against Arcadio Alvarez took place. There, the abuser maintained his version that Nydia was not his biological daughter but an adopted one, and stated that the two had agreed to love each other. What he could not explain was how he could have made such an agreement with a girl of 5 years old, which was the age she was when he violated her for the first time. Following this hearing, Arcadio was transferred to the local jail amidst a crowd gathered at the courthouse gates to shout insults at the abuser. The police had to act quickly to remove him from the place, as many in the crowd wanted to physically assault him. The detainee was charged with sexual abuse, violent carnal access, and incest against his daughter Alba Nydia Alvarez. By that time, the case had become well known, and the press had given it full attention. Despite everything Nydia had suffered, she showed her enormous heart as a mother during her conversation with journalists. She always stated that her greatest fear during all those years of subjugation was that her children might become victims of assaults like she was. Nydia maintained that this was something she never allowed, and she also stated that every interaction with her father made her feel very bad, and she did not want the story to repeat with her daughters, a point she had made very clear to Arsadio, warning him that if he ever laid a hand on any of her daughters, that would be the end of the docile and good person he had known. She hinted in her interaction with the media that she also resented that what was happening to her was an open secret and no one offered her the least bit of support. She confirmed that she never gave birth in a health center. All her childbirths were attended by midwives at home who knew the situation, but only asked if the new baby was the child of the same father. By that time, her oldest child was 19 years old, and the youngest was only 1 year old. In 2009, the trial against Arsadio ended, with no further details found, except, of course, that in response to the accused's claims that Nydia was not his biological daughter, comparative DNA tests were ordered. The Colombian Institute of Forensic Sciences confirmed that the man was lying, as the tests proved she was indeed his daughter. It was also revealed that the prosecution originally tried to add an additional charge for sexual acts against a minor under 14 years of age for an alleged abuse against one of his daughters, but the fact could never be proven, and in the end, the prosecution dropped this charge. The media reported that in the initial session, Arsadio pleaded innocent, but after 12 hours of hearing Nydia's valuable testimony and the DNA evidence, the accused ended up accepting the charges against him and even apologized to his daughter and his grandchildren. With his admission of guilt in October 2009, the presiding judge sentenced Arsadio Alvarez to 15 years and 7 months in prison, a sentence that undoubtedly seemed almost an offense to the victims and did not take into account the number of people whose lives were severely affected. And there was yet another incomprehensible detail. Although the reasons were not found, the sentence was later reduced to 11 years, 7 months, and some days. After the trial and under the protection of the Colombian Institute of Family Welfare, Nydia and her 6 younger children were relocated and placed in a house in good condition in Bogotá, the country's capital, with the aim of starting a new life away from the place where everyone knew them and would constantly remind them of what had happened. This is the last information that could be found about this family. And talking about Arsadio, the insufficient sentence was not even fully served. As in 2011, the authorities of that institution reported that Arsadio had died. According to a press release issued by the prison authorities 2 weeks before, the individual had been hospitalized for surgery due to gallstones. But the day after being discharged and returned to prison, the guards found him dead in his cell. The report stated that the death occurred due to natural causes. At the end of this case, the lesson of Nydia's courage and her struggle to provide for her surviving children remained. But the undeniable pain of so many years and the deaths of 6 little ones, either because their pregnancies did not come to term or due to being born under inadequate conditions, was undoubtedly very difficult to overcome. At the time of the events, the director of the Colombian Institute of Family Welfare stated that he had never known a case of this magnitude in Colombia and expressed concern that a situation of so many years had not been denounced by anyone. The official was not only referring to a complaint from the victim, who was the most fragile and had the least opportunity to do so, but also to the community members who knew about the situation but chose to remain silent. In a conversation with the press, One of the sons who stayed with the father tried to make sense of the events from his humble point of view. But the truth is that nothing justifies what happened in this case. Nydia lived for about 30 years dreaming for freedom, but without the courage to obtain it, as the abuse started at such a young age that it left her unable to defend herself. Inside, she was a terrified child, even at the age of 30. After finally being freed from her abusive father, the woman stated that all that went through her mind was the hope that her children could have a better future, that they would study to progress in life, form their homes, and feel at peace. And perhaps the great lesson of this case is advice for other women that Nydia repeated several times to the media. She pointed out that if they found themselves in a similar situation, they should find a way to speak out, to denounce, and trust in God to move forward. For Nydia, silence was her father's perfect accomplice, not just her own silence, but that of all those who, knowing the situation, preferred to look the other way. And that's the end of today's case. As always, I appreciate your support for my work. If you subscribe, like, and share this video, it will help me continue creating content. This was another episode of Unreal True Crime. See you soon.
Day after day, we are surrounded by the presence of criminals. We are spectators to the deepest darkness in human actions and the bizarre reality that someone's suffering can be a form of pleasure. As dedicated investigators of the criminal world, we're on a mission to uncover the most shocking crimes and get inside the minds of those who commit them. I am Luke, and today I bring you another Unreal True Crime. The horrible case of Laura Cielo Lopez. Laura Cielo Lopez was born on November 11, 2000, in the city of Plotier, Argentina. Her older sisters, Melissa and Damaris, adored her from the very first moment. When Laura was just 3 years old, her mother passed away in a car accident, leaving the three sisters in the care of their father. Initially, he worked hard to keep the family afloat, but a few years later, he fell into alcoholism. Despite the terrible things happening around her, Laura was a very sweet and affectionate child, which is why her sisters started calling her Cielo, or Heaven, in English, a nickname that everyone who knew her would eventually adopt. As the years went by, the girl's father lost his job, and all of them had to look for work. At 18, Laura spent her days selling fried cakes, then attended high school in the evening shift, and in her free time, she took care of her nephews. She was very close to graduating and dreamed of finding a good job to restore financial stability to her family. Unfortunately, an event occurred that prevented this from happening. On September 12, 2019, Cielo spent the entire afternoon with Damaris, serving her mate while she cleaned the house. Her sister joked that it was the first time she had made the infusion correctly. It was a cheerful day. Later, Cielo went to school, where her classmates noticed she was acting strange. She didn't sit in her usual spot, but at the back of the classroom, and left 20 minutes before class ended. Around 11:30 p.m., she arrived home, where she met up with some friends. They spent a good time chatting, drinking beer, and taking selfies to post on Instagram. At 3 in the morning, they said goodbye to Cielo because she was very tired and said she was going to sleep. The next day, Melissa wrote to her asking if she had gone to a medical appointment for an ear problem, but she got no response. She then called Damaris to find out if she was with her. The concern grew as Cielo was also not at her house. Hours passed, and the young woman still hadn't appeared, so they decided to report her missing to the police. Once at the police station, the officers told them they had to wait 48 hours from the last time they saw Cielo to request a search. They claimed she was probably with some boy, as this was supposedly common among teenagers. However, by Saturday, Cielo had not shown any signs of life, and the police finally took the report and began searching for her, but it was already too late. On Sunday the 15th, two fishermen, aged between 20 and 30, were carrying out their work in the area of the breakwaters of the Limay River. This location was only 15 kilometers from Cielo's house. They were calm until they saw something that took their breath away: the body of a young woman, cut into 8 parts, floating in the water. They quickly notified the authorities. On arrival, the first thing the authorities noticed was the brutality of the body's condition. It had clearly been cut by someone skilled with knives. The detectives continued to search the area to see if they could find clues about the victim's identity. Nearby in the same river, they found some tights and underwear. Not far away, they found 2 rings and, eventually, a knife full of blood at the bottom of the river. They decided to call Cielo's family. When Damaris arrived at the scene and saw the objects, she did not doubt for a second that they belonged to her sister. The autopsy was conducted by Dr. Carlos, who noted that the cause of death had been a severe skull trauma, causing internal cerebral hemorrhage. The trauma was caused by a blow to the occipital part of the head, resulting in loss of consciousness. Cielo had been agonizing for 2 to 4 hours. Had she received medical attention, she might have survived. She also had bruises on her arms, indicating she had been struck and had struggled to save herself from her attacker. Moreover, the forensic examination confirmed what Cielo's sisters feared. The body had intimate injuries compatible with abuse. Finally, it indicated that due to the characteristics of the cuts on the neck, arms, and legs, it could be affirmed that the perpetrator used knives with a flat and scalloped edge, meaning they had no medical or anatomical knowledge, which broadened the list of suspects. The detectives had no idea who could have committed such a heinous crime. By analyzing the location of Cielo's cell phone, they detected that a man had contacted her after 3 in the morning on Friday. His name was Alfredo Escobar. He was 28 years old and worked as a mechanic. In the past, he had attended the same high school as Cielo. He was fond of fishing, which likely meant he knew how to handle a knife. The distance between his home and the crime scene was 2.5 kilometers, or about 20 blocks, which helped with the cell phone tower signals. At 3 o'clock, 3:22, 3:36, and 3:40 a.m. on September 13th, the young woman received 4 calls from this man. By then, the cell towers placed each of them in their respective homes. Then both cell phones were activated at her house. Starting at 4:29 a.m., the young woman's phone moved towards the downtown area and ended up at Escobar's residence. At 5 a.m., Cielo uploaded a WhatsApp story with an alien emoji. Her cell phone was still at the man's house. By 5:52 a.m., the young woman's mobile phone stopped emitting a signal, and after that, no one heard from her again. These records also showed that Escobar turned off his cell phone until 11:05 p.m. the next day. At that time, the phone was picked up by a cell tower in the place where Cielo's remains were later found. At 12:05 a.m. on Sunday, September 15th, he returned to his home. The investigation also included analysis of videos from 13 security cameras, including urban monitoring, private homes, and businesses, specifically reviewing footage from the early hours of September 13th. In 2 of these video records, 2 people could be seen walking back to back, resembling Cielo and Escobar, matching the young woman's cell phone movement. There was no doubt. Escobar was the only suspect in the case. During the investigation, one of the officers recognized him, recalling an encounter a year prior. Escobar had crashed into a police patrol while driving at over 80 kilometers per hour, resisted arrest, and had an active case against him. He was close to going to trial for this incident, but now he faced a completely different and much more serious charge. On September 17th, a police watch was set up about 30 meters from Escobar's house. At 8:30 a.m., they saw a car arrive, and a young person who appeared to be the suspect got out. He entered the house and then came out accompanied by two adults around 60 years old. All three got into the vehicle. Without raising suspicion, the officers followed the vehicle for a while, noting that it stopped near a highway bridge. At that moment, Escobar and the older man got out of the car, and the police approached them to request their documentation. Escobar was in the company of his father, and the other person inside the vehicle was none other than his mother. It was clear they were attempting to flee the city. The young man did not resist the procedure but appeared extremely nervous. He asked if he could smoke and wanted to move away from the police car. When told this was not possible, he put out the cigarette, sat in his car, and lit one. After a while, he was taken to the police station, and the vehicle was confiscated. A few hours later, he underwent medical examinations, which revealed inflammation in the knuckles of his right hand, consistent with having thrown a punch. He also had cuts on one finger and a bruise on the palm of his right hand. These injuries dated back a few days, likely to the date of Cielo's death, probably incurred while attacking the young woman. Following these examinations, Escobar was formally charged with abuse, carnal access, and femicide, utilizing his right to remain silent. He was placed in pretrial detention for 6 months, as there was considered to be a risk of flight or obstruction of the investigation. On September 17th, the first search of the Escobar family's house was conducted. The property was large, with 60 meters in depth and 12 meters in front. In the back, there was a construction project of 2 apartments. Entering the room where Escobar slept, they discovered that the walls had marks. They tested them with luminol and found what they suspected: blood. Then they went to the backyard, where things only got worse. Among the vegetation, they found blood remains. It was clear that Cielo had received there the blow that caused her death. The investigators took the blood to compare it with Cielo's and Escobar's, and also ordered a DNA test on the fluid found on Cielo's body to see if it matched the suspects. Escobar's lawyer argued that until those results were available, they should not accuse him of abuse. Fortunately, the results arrived quickly. The Central Laboratory of the Ministry of Public Health compared the samples collected during the search with the genetic profile of the victim and the accused. All showed a match. They also analyzed the sneakers that Escobar was wearing at the time of his arrest and the knife found at the bottom of the river. Both items had Cielo's DNA on them. Then, 3 swabs were taken from the intimate areas, and one of them showed compatibility with Escobar's DNA. The investigators were now in a position to affirm that the subject had abused Cielo, then murdered her, dismembered her, and disposed of her body. On September 21, the justice system confirmed these findings during a press conference. The case prosecutor stated that he suspected the individual had murdered Cielo to hide the abuse. If found guilty of this charge, he would receive a life sentence. However, more evidence was still needed. Escobar declared himself innocent, but again, technology would expose him. His cell phone was confiscated, and by court order, he had to provide the access code for forensic analysis. It was found that although he had Cielo among his contacts, he had deleted her after the night of her disappearance. After committing the act between 6 and 10 in the morning, he deleted the call log to the victim, but he did not delete their Facebook Messenger chat. The investigation also revealed that on September 11, 12, and 13, the subject had accessed this social network to view the photographs Cielo uploaded. Despite the evidence, the sinister man continued to claim his innocence, but everything was against him. A hypothesis was finally formulated about what happened on the night of the crime. On Thursday, September 12, 2019, Cielo left high school around 8 at night, returned home, and spent some time with friends until 3 in the morning, when she told them she was tired and would go to sleep. 40 minutes after she was left alone, she received a message from Escobar, and they began to chat. Although they knew each other from living in the same city and attending the same school, they were not friends. However, they had mutual acquaintances, which gave her confidence. After a while of chatting, the subject asked if she could come over. She calmly accepted, and at 4, he picked her up and went to his house. What happened in the house was a mystery, but considering the forensic analysis, it was believed that Cielo opposed having relations with the man. Completely enraged, he proceeded to abuse her. After committing the terrible act, he began to fear that she would report him. That's when he decided to take her life. He took her to the back of the house and hit her twice in the head. However, he did not achieve his goal. Cielo was still alive, agonizing. In a totally cruel act, Escobar hid her body for a couple of hours while thinking about what to do. He turned off his phone so that no one would bother him. Cielo's body was in the under-construction part of the house for almost 24 hours. During that time, the contusion she had received took her life. Finally, the subject dismembered the body with a sharp knife from his kitchen, hid the body in his car, and drove 15 kilometers to the area at the Limahe River. He disposed of the body parts, throwing them away as if they were worthless. Once there, he turned his phone back on, relieved and believing he had finished the job. The story of the case became public, and all of city strongly condemned the accused. But the most striking declaration came from Escobar's 23-year-old younger sister, who posted a message on her social networks addressing both her brother and the victim. The publication received mixed reactions. Some people empathized with her, while others accused her of being complicit. Following these attacks, the girl asked that the focus not be lost on what was important, Cielo and her family. She demanded that the fight continue so that there would be no more victims of femicide. Melissa, on her part, contacted Escobar's sister and thanked her for the post. She also requested that people stop attacking her, as she was not to blame. Then the trial against the accused began. In the first hearing, the prosecutor accused Escobar of being the only responsible for the act. The charge was for aggravated homicide against a woman, involving gender violence and abuse with carnal access. In that same hearing, the experts who had intervened in the analysis of the clothing found in the river alongside the remains, and in the evidence found at the bottom of the subject's home, testified. But the most striking confession came from Cielo's best friend. During the trial, she recounted that for months, Escobar had been sending messages to Cielo, inviting her to have a good time and drink beer, but they had never had a date. For her part, she had known him for about 5 years and was aware of his bad reputation. For a long time, Escobar's house had been a party place. Every weekend, the house was filled with alcohol and substances, and there were even couples who had intimacy in front of the rest of those present. She had attended those gatherings but decided to distance herself from that environment when she started a relationship and became pregnant. She emphasized that Cielo had never gone with her. She repeatedly advised Cielo not to meet with Escobar. Cielo always said she wouldn't and that she ignored his messages. However, The defense asked why she didn't recommend Cielo to block the contact. Firmly, she replied that it was her friend's decision, and she didn't want to tell her what to do with her life. While she remained on the stand, she was shown the security camera footage from the day Cielo disappeared. They specifically showed her the footage from 4 in the morning, where 2 people were seen walking backwards through downtown. She had no doubt in recognizing that it was Cielo. She said that her sneakers, her coat, and her way of walking were unmistakable, and she also identified Escobar. As if this witness was not enough, another woman expressed her need to testify against the accused. The prosecution and the victim's family requested that her name remain anonymous and that the accused not be present. The judge granted the request, but allowed the accused to stay on one side of the room, out of the witness's sight. The woman narrated that, sometime before the incident, Escobar had gone out with her. They met through Facebook, the same social network through which he contacted Cielo. They bought 2 beers and took a walk around the neighborhood, then bought 2 more beers. It was then that Escobar invited her to his house, with clear intentions of intimacy. She told him she didn't want to, and the man appeared frustrated, but did not force her. She told him she wanted to change, to be someone new. They were together until about 2 in the morning. Once Escobar returned home, he messaged her again, asking her to have sex. He insisted for a while, but she stopped responding. It was probably at that moment that he contacted Cielo. When the girl found out he was the main suspect in the incident, she was in shock. She hesitated a lot before going to the police station, thinking that if she talked to him, she might convince him to turn himself in voluntarily, but that didn't happen. After hearing the statement, the defense asked if Escobar had been violent towards her in an attempt to discredit her story. She replied that he had not. However, Escobar's impulsive behavior was evident when a friend testified against him, saying he was a womanizer with a substance addiction. His ex-partner also took the stand, stating they had not ended on good terms. Years earlier, she had reported him because she suspected that he had broken into her house and stolen her money. When she confronted him to return her things, Escobar hit the friend who was with her. In response to these statements, the accused tried to defend himself, pointing to a friend who was also his drug dealer as the perpetrator of the crime. He narrated that on the night in question, he was under the influence of substances, and this man was with Cielo at his house. At one point, Escobar heard a scream from one of his rooms and ran to see what had happened. Once he saw the blood, he focused on cleaning it up, then helped his friend hide Cielo's body, referring to it as that thing. At the end of his story, he thanked for having the space to share his version of the truth. However, no evidence was found, and this statement did not prosper. Escobar remained the only suspect. In his closing argument, the prosecutor argued that the man had taken advantage of his prior knowledge of the victim and betrayed her trust. He planned the brutality of his actions and the despicable manner in which he had dismembered and hidden the body. He asserted that the accused had a contemptuous relationship with women, evidenced when he referred to Cielo's body as that thing. The jury's deliberation took only 40 minutes. In a unanimous verdict, Escobar was found guilty of abuse with carnal access and homicide. The latter had the aggravating factor of having been carried out to hide the abuse and for involving gender violence. For this reason, he was sentenced to life imprisonment. Although the case did not go unpunished and tranquility was restored to the community, the problem has not been solved. The rate of cases in Argentina continues to rise every minute. The case of Cielo highlights the need for a program to educate children, young people, and adults on gender issues. The young woman's family launched an initiative to make this possible. In September 2020, almost a year after the murder, the Cielo Lopez Law was approved. This law mandates training on the subject for students and teachers at all levels of the provincial educational system to prevent violence against women. And that's the end of today's case. As always, I appreciate your support for my work. If you subscribe, like, and share this video, it will help me continue creating content. This was another episode of Unreal True Crime. See you soon.